morning, dear friends, partners, and supporters. COVID-19 may be having a devastating impact on our industries, social lives, and democratic processes in some countries. But it is also prompting an outpouring of creativity in other arenas. I am Philip Abu Zaid, and this is MENA on the Map. Today, we would like to welcome a very special guest, Alec Ross, American author and former senior advisor for innovation to the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Alec, it's very difficult for me to summarize your whole career in few sentences, but let me mention first the success of your book called The Industries of the Future, which has been translated into 24 languages and been a bestseller on 4 continents. And second, your love to Beirut, our beloved city. Welcome.
Hi Alec. All roads apparently lead to Beirut. I had the chance to meet you in 2012 when the debate over the influence of the digital world on the democratic crises in the MENA region was a heated one. Your visit to Beirut came amidst the so-called Arab Spring that kicked off a decade in which technology and social media would play a major role in shifting geopolitical powers. Alec, I would like to welcome you again and thank you for joining us. Hope the lockdown is treating you well. In 8 years, so many things changed. As described in your book, new industries such as robotics, genetics, coding, and big data will change the way we live, and they started to actually, until Corona happened. We should recognize that this is a moment, a historical moment, in which that stopped everything in our lives, basically one aspect of our life, which is our habits on so many levels. Our political habits, our economic habits, our social habits. Yet it created opportunities to think, experiment, fail fast, move forward, and re-experiment again. Without using fancy words, it gave an opportunity for innovators to innovate. In our talk today, we would like to focus on 2 main things: innovation and health crisis, and also innovation and diplomatic and geopolitical crises. Let's start with Corona. We thought in 2012 that we will have clearer answers in 2020. 8 years later, here we are. If you have to evaluate the evolution of science and technology, do you think that we succeeded in answering most of the questions? Which gaps the coronavirus came to reveal? Do we have more answers?
There will always be more questions to answer in science and technology. We'll never catch up. When I think about technology over the last 20 years, I think that the greatest advancements we've made are really in communication. The way that you contacted me, Yara, was over Facebook Messenger. It used to be the case that instead of contacting me on Messenger, maybe you would have had to write me a letter, and you would have put it in the post in Beirut, and it would have reached me in the United States in 2 weeks. Now we can WhatsApp each other. Our world no longer knows the barriers of vast distances in terms of communication. But there are obviously huge gaps as well. So when we think, for example, about coronavirus, part of what that's revealed is it has shown the lack of progress we've made addressing some things. And I think that when we think about the lack of progress, I think part of what we've been doing as we've been building apps over the last 10 years, we have not been addressing some of the bigger threats in our world. Pandemics are one of them. Climate change is another. I think that our innovation so far, while it's good, has been a bit too narrow. It has been mostly focused on what I call the appification of life, as opposed to more foundational innovation in the sciences, in energy, in fields like these.
Alec, I want to continue the idea where you just finished your statement. Do you think that it was wise to spend billions on weapons, machine guns, border control, and to neglect the research on medicine and preventive scenarios for such pandemic? For example, I was going through social media last week, and I saw many speeches for former presidents like George W. Bush and Obama talking about facing bird flu or pandemics or what have been done to do this or to prevent this. Nothing has been done.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, there have been challenges in the past, but other presidents were successful. We had Ebola, and the Obama administration successfully addressed it. We had H1N1, and the Bush administration it successfully addressed it. And so there is a success. There is a history of success in this area. Obviously, coronavirus is the first example of a lack of success, and I think that the major culprits for this really are the Chinese government, the World Health Organization, and the Trump administration. Where we had global leadership against Ebola, where we had global leadership in SARS and H1N1, the Chinese government, the World Health Organization, and the Trump administration failed this time. And it's not just a matter of money. I mean, we have plenty of money in the United States. We've spent too much of that money on the military, as you noted, but it's really about making smarter choices. And among the choices that we made, that the Trump administration made when he became president, was he took the office that was focused on pandemics, that had successfully addressed Ebola in the United States, and Trump closed it. I mean, you make choices and you live with those consequences of those choices. Similarly, we are going to continue to have more and more extreme climate weather, more hurricanes, more flooding, more extreme weather because we aren't addressing climate change. So it's not, we in the United States, we have plenty of money. What we are doing is we're making bad choices on how we spend that money.
Alec, you have mentioned China. I was surprised personally to see how they use technology, for example, face recognition, AI, to control kind of the pandemic. Were you amazed the same way?
Yeah, I mean, look, we don't know what's happened in China. I mean, let's be honest. We know what they're reporting, but most experts significantly doubt the validity of what's coming out of China. So the degree to which they have controlled it, we aren't exactly sure. What they do have is they have 300 million surveillance cameras. They have a very powerful technology infrastructure that enables them to monitor their public in a way in which certainly isn't true in Beirut. It isn't true anywhere in the United States because of issues related to civil liberties. But what they have done pretty effectively is control the population, and in so doing, controlling the spread of coronavirus. Now, I think the numbers of what has happened in coronavirus, I think the indications are that far more people have died there than have been reported. But they have a command and control authoritarian government, and an authoritarian government is able to close down the population more easily than is the case in a more democratic, in a more open, in a more independent culture and political environment.
This is the struggle in the U.S., Alec. Now, 2 weeks ago, there was a hearing done by the Senate called Enlisting Big Data in the Fight Against Corona. But the use of digital tools now, for instance, now in the U.S. To address public health is still an issue. Especially that the U.S. has to, as a democracy and a democratic system, has to compromise on so many rights, including individual privacy rights. And do you think it is feasible in the U.S. to take this approach? This is the first question that I would ask. But also, in an article in Foreign Policy, the authors wrote that the apps are coming, but what we need is we need policy first. So you think policymakers and in the United States are ready to actually succumb to big data, especially under this severe pandemic?
Not at all. I could give you a longer answer, but the answer is no. There's a tension between security and liberty. And the culture of the United States, going back to before we were even a country, is when there's a tension between security and liberty, you choose liberty. It's who we are. Even right now, there are protests all across the country, very angry almost violent protests of people protesting against the quarantine, against the lockdown. So no, the American people are not going to accept a sort of Chinese style form of big data surveillance and control. It's just, even if it would keep the country healthier over the short term, it cuts across the culture of the country. And honestly, you would have, men in guns shooting down the cameras, if they thought that they were being monitored at all. Mentality. This is the culture in this country.
This brings me into my second question that I wanted to ask. I was basically listening a few days ago, again, your speech in Beirut, and you were talking about this dilemma, security versus liberty. And what you mentioned is these two concepts are equally opposite, and they should coexist in a way or another. In this time of coronavirus, where our health is actually under, our lives are jeopardized and under threat, real threat. Do you think that in this case, security and liberty, personally, as Alec Ross, should come together in this context?
Yeah, no, you're always balancing security and liberty. You can never have all one or all the other. If you have all security and no liberty, then it's like North Korea. If you have all liberty and no security, I guess you can do that in a place like Iceland. But if you're the United States, you can't do that. There's a contract between the governing and the governed. And in a moment like coronavirus, you give up a little bit of liberty in the common interest. I would love to be out and going to cafes right now. I would love to be, flying around the world doing whatever I want to do right now. But I am personally choosing not to. I'm happy to give up my liberty in the common interest of public health security. So there's give and there's take. It has to be equilibrium. And because we're in a moment of crisis, what we're all doing is we're saying we're going to give up a little bit of our liberty in exchange for more of our security. And you can see even with that, people are protesting. I mean, it's interesting. Previous generations were called to go off to war. Our generation is just being called off to, sit on your couch and watch movies. It's not a huge sacrifice, but many people are still protesting it.
But Alec, let me bring you to the region, because we're putting MENA on the map. We are facing kind of the same problem here in Lebanon. For example, many families work and they earn money day by day. So how can you face that? And what is the role of governments in such a period of crisis to support these families?
And, we're talking about privilege. And, I think that I call it the white collar quarantine. For those of us who are knowledge workers, who can do our work over computers, we can do this. For people who make their money day by day, hand to hand, selling vegetables or driving a taxi, it's not as feasible. What is the role of government? Well, look, this is a case where there's a big difference between Lebanon and the United States. If I'm not mistaken, Lebanon recently defaulted on its sovereign debt, right? Yes. So it's not in a position to do what the United States did. In the United States, we passed a $2.2 trillion with a T, bailout package, with money going directly to people, money going directly to small businesses, and money going directly to big businesses. In Lebanon, you can't do that because you can't print dollar bills. You can't print dollar bills. So the role of government is going to be very different in the United States than it is in Lebanon. We can print dollar bills, Lebanon cannot. So I think coming out of coronavirus, the United States has a lot to hold itself to account. I would say that one of the things that in Lebanon, there's going to have to be a kind of fiscal discipline and fiscal responsibility so that in the future, it can deficit spend if it needs to, but right now it can't.
We were focusing more on Lebanon, but if we think of the MENA region, the MENA region is part of the places that somehow was able to contain more or less, and it depends on the country, the pandemic. But due to like severe government measures towards lockdown and individual movement, while the cases of South Korea, of Taiwan, of Singapore, in these countries, like they basically use digital surveillance to identify patients, sort the sick from the healthy, limit the virus spread, and so on. Like in this context, like do you think that at least for the time being, like civilian surveillance, because we're talking about success stories in Taiwan and South Korea, is a tool to prevent pandemics? And we're not talking only about corona, Alex, because like in the future we might face other types of outbreaks and virus outbreaks.
Yeah, so in Taiwan and South Korea, it wasn't surveillance, it was testing. It was universal testing and regular testing to be able to identify who had contracted the virus and who hadn't. There's some body temperature cameras that are out there, but if you look at the tactics actually taken by the governments of Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan, there are really two things that they did that make them different than the European countries and the United States. Number one, mass testing. That is really important. And the second thing is they started earlier. Waiting, in the United States and Europe, we waited a couple extra weeks, and those extra weeks before locking down were critical. If you lock down early, you get a much better result. And so surveillance, I would say, was a minor, not a major factor in those East Asian countries. What I would say was mass testing and having the discipline to lock down earlier. In the United States and in Europe, there has not been as much mass testing. So we had asymptomatic carriers, people who had the virus, but were not feeling badly, spreading the virus. There's a factor at 2.2. Every person who has coronavirus spreads it to an average of 2.2 people. And what's bad is because of the high level of asymptomatic people, the high percentage of people who have coronavirus but don't know it, that number can be as high as 8, 9, or 10. This then creates an exponential factor. What they did in Singapore, Taiwan, and Korea is because they tested everybody, the people who felt good but were still carriers knew it. And they could quarantine even though they didn't feel badly, and they wouldn't spread it.
The thing, just to keep it this way, like, but also they were like releasing data, and of course anonymous data publicly, so people can avoid places with a high like risk of being infected. And on this, like, a lot of major companies are like now are overcoming their rivalries, such as Google and Apple, to actually coordinate in order to fight the virus. So what do you think on this level? The issue of data is very important. Maybe we think now on the short run that we need to get done with this business of this corona business, but on the long term also, like who owns this data, and how like this data will help in innovating more in terms of like in the medical field?
There are a variety of different approaches to managing data in this context. So right now, every morning when I wake up, I am able to check how many people in my postal code have tested positive for coronavirus. And that is data that the state is publishing. So I know in my neighborhood where there are incidences of it. And it's funny, the other night, my wife was saying, we're both so tired, we should get takeout from a restaurant. And she mentioned one restaurant, and I actually I checked the data, and I saw that the area around that restaurant had a lot of coronavirus. So I said, no, let's not get it from that restaurant. So that's good. And I think that's an effective way of using data. For companies like Apple and Google, though, honestly, I'm not willing to give them my health data. I'm not, sorry. It's just, uh, and especially, Apple and Google are better than Facebook.
Definitely.
Not all of these,
Yes.
not all of these companies are the same, but I don't trust a bunch of 28-year-olds in California with my most sensitive data. Google has a lot of it and has done a good job of it. Apple has a lot of it and has done a good job. Amazon, it appears, just uses it to make money. But Facebook, for example, I think has a long history of being irresponsible. And Twitter, I would never give any of my data to, because it seems like most of the people who work at Twitter, it seems like, are people who couldn't get jobs at these other companies. So
That's tough.
I'm very nervous about who I give my data to. And sometimes we have choices and sometimes we don't. So, it's like going back to security and liberty. I want really good email, so I use Gmail, which is owned by Google. So I surrender an enormous amount of my data to Google. I try to surrender a little bit less of it to Facebook, and I try to surrender none of it to Twitter. So it's all choices we make.
Alec, I know your time is tight. What if COVID-19 was still around upcoming November 2020? Will there be elections, or what can be done? And is there a role for innovation in politics? And what do you suggest as solution if you were to launch these elections?
Yeah, that's such an important question, Philip. Thank you for asking it. I mean, first of all, it's hard to imagine that coronavirus will be 100% gone in November. I think that if Donald Trump has the opportunity to use coronavirus to change the election in any way, he will. He has a long record of lying, of cheating. He will steal the election in any way that he can. And if he can use coronavirus to sort of change the polling places, or to say, oh, well, if you live in these certain areas where there's a lot of density, meaning the cities, which is where more Democratic voters are, then you have to vote by mail. I could see this government doing anything in order to ensure its reelection. What should happen, this is going to be a terrible answer, Philip, but I'm just going to tell you, it doesn't matter what I think in terms of how we could innovate in this election, because of the government that is in place. It is a federal election. So somebody could have a brilliant idea and it doesn't matter. First of all, because that brilliant idea could never be integrated in the next 6 months, with the election just being in 6 months. And secondly, I don't think Donald Trump wants full participation in the election. He will do he will do whatever he can to reduce the vote from the cities and increase the vote from the countryside, from the rural areas. So that's a terrible answer, but it's a truthful answer.
Thank you for your honesty. The term crisis in the MENA region unfolds different connotations and meanings. You have served under the Obama administration at the State Department, where, as mentioned in your bio, the role of advisor on innovation was created for you to help modernize the practice of diplomacy. My question would be, how innovative approaches helped the Obama administration to survive diplomatic crisis? And what were the practices?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are lots of things that we use to try to innovate in diplomacy. I'll give you a couple examples. One, you may remember many years ago, 10 years ago now, there was a huge earthquake in Haiti, and it killed 250,000 people. What we did is we created a program called Text Haiti, where anybody with a mobile phone could send a text to a short code 90999. And by sending a text to that short code, $10 would be donated from their mobile phone account to the relief efforts in Haiti. And we raised $40 million doing that. So first of all, we we did some really interesting things with development. We also did a lot to be able to more effectively communicate with foreign publics. So it used to be the case that American diplomats only cared about 200 people in a country. It could be a country as small as Lebanon or as big as Egypt. It didn't matter. The number was the same, 200. Where it were the 200 elites who controlled the government, who controlled the media, who ran the big businesses. And whether it was the smallest country in the world or the biggest country in the world, American diplomats only cared about engaging these 200 elites. But what we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years is that publics matter. It's not just the 200 elites in a country that matter. And so diplomats sort of had to learn to adjust a little bit, to go from being able to communicate with just 200 elites to being able to communicate with a much larger population. This sort of works against the DNA of most diplomats. And for most diplomats, they aren't good at it. They don't enjoy it, but it nevertheless is a necessary function. So the other thing that I would cite is we introduced the concept of communicating to broader publics and not just to the super elite in a country.
Quickly, if you had to advise President Trump on that matter, what
I
would
don't
be
think
your
he will
advice?
advise President Trump.
If
Doesn't need any advice from me. I say that social media is like nuclear power. It can be used to fuel a city, to bring electricity, or it can be used to destroy a city. And Trump is a very sophisticated user of social media. He knows how to get the man on the street angry. He knows how to manipulate the information environment.
Yeah.
So he doesn't, and it's not intellectual for him. It's instinctual. It's like, there's some people, I'm sure Yara and Philip, you both have friends, people who know how to send like the perfect tweet, or, they have the perfect social media voice, or they know just how to take the pulse of people.
Yeah, that's Philip. That's Philip.
Is that Philip? So there are people who get it, and Donald Trump is one of those people who get it. Hillary Clinton was sort of the opposite. Hillary Clinton, very intellectual, but she didn't have that sort of instinct for how to use social media. Barack Obama was sort of between the two. He wasn't Trump, he wasn't Hillary. So Trump doesn't need anybody to advise him. What he needs is for somebody to take his phone away so that he doesn't terrorize us on Twitter. The first thing I read this morning was a tweet from Donald Trump where he announced that he was stopping immigration to the United States. So he is governing by Twitter, and it is a nightmare.
Just to go back on the shift that you talked about in power, like you said, before 200 people matters in diplomatic relations, but with the technology and definitely the rise of social media, you came to realize under the Obama administration that the public matter. And this is something that you also mentioned very prominently in your speech when you were in Beirut in 2012. I would like to ask you more about your role in the Innovation Office in the State Department amidst the Arab Spring, because there are a lot of talks about the role of the Obama administration when the Arab Spring started, especially because some of the incidents in certain countries, for example Egypt, were kind of worked against the U.S. interests in the region. So what was mainly your role, and how were you able to actually change this type of diplomacy towards in the midst of the Arab Spring?
So the first thing I would say is people give the United States too much power when it came to the Arab Spring. Yeah. I think that, if you go back to Sidi Bouzid, in Tunisia in December of, I think it was 2009, 2010. Look, the United States had nothing to do with whether it was Tahrir Square, whether it was in Tunisia, those were people from the region. But there is a mentality where, you know, people think that the United States is sort of manipulating things from up here, and that honestly gives us too much power. You know, what the United States did, and what my role was, was people were using American technology tools like Facebook and like Twitter, and my job was to help keep those open, to keep them from being censored, to keep them from being shut down, not to try to necessarily create a specific political outcome, but because we believe that the free flow of information and the freedom of expression is a universal right. You know, Article 19 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And, you know, I think what we now know in 2020 that not everybody knew in 2012, but I certainly knew it, was that these tools can be used by dictators as easily as they can be used for street protest. And in many respects, the dictators can use it more effectively. Look at Trump. You know, look at how Erdogan has used it in Turkey. So I think that there was a lot of naivete, not on my part. You know, I think I understood it then, that these are very powerful tools that can be used just as easily by dictators as by protesters.
This is like something that I remember in 2012. We were like praising social media to bring up, like, for bringing up the liberal and free voices in the Arab world. And I remember in the same conference, the next year, we were talking about how regimes are using social media tools to actually oppress people. And also, like, there's,
Regimes, they, even if they aren't as good at social media as Philip, even if they don't have, you know, that that natural instinct, they understand power. And so if they see power being exercised through these tools, then they're going to figure out how to use them.
That's why, like, basically it's been now a lot of people are criticizing a bit like the Obama administration foreign policy towards the Middle East, because it opened up for, because of this, like, opening up for civil liberties, led the entrance of different powers who are actually abusing what's happening in the Middle East. We don't want to make it more like long.
If you can give us one more minute for one last question, since you mentioned this topic on social media. Actually, I was trying to advertise on Facebook lately. And there is a notice that says any political ads must have kinds of approval and the long list and so on. So does it mean that they are doing this to prevent what happened with Cambridge Analytica and with the Trump campaign and with the Russian, you know all the story. So intervention.
They're doing it to try to keep from what the Russian, it wasn't Cambridge Analytica. What Cambridge Analytica did in 2016 is not really what I think they're trying to contain here. What they're trying to contain is the manipulation coming from foreign governments. So when Russia would create fake news or fake ads, and it would be pushed through, you know, these troll farms with no idea where it actually came from, that is what these policies from Facebook are trying to contain. So we'll see how effective they are. I hope they are effective. I hope the 2020 election has more integrity than the 2016 election. I am an optimistic person, but I'm not terribly optimistic about this.
Alec, thank you so much for joining us on MENA on the Map. It really meant a lot to us, especially in these difficult times. We wanted to have you in Beirut, but hopefully soon. And just stay safe, stay healthy. And since this interview now is like at 11 a.m., it's Wednesday today, Beirut time, live on FNF MENA account. We will have it tomorrow on FNF North America account at also like 11 a.m. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.